A big welcome to 2021 Urban Tree Festival Tree Rings webinar, The Elms of Nine Elms and Beyond. My name's Simon Edwards. I'm one of the Urban Tree Festival committee and probably best known for tweeting trees at Tickle Me. Do follow. Before we start, I'd like you to ask you to consider a donation to the Urban Tree Festival. We've had some sponsorship to cover admin from GLA, Woodland Trust, Trees for Cities and Wandsworth Council. But in order to guarantee we can come back next year, donations are essential. I've put a link at the top of the, or I will put a link at the top of the chat. Now, today we'll be talking about elms. I'm thinking in particular about the elms of Nine Elms. I don't know about you, but I always get a bit anxious about elms, their identification, the number of varieties, the fact we see so few. Fortunately, we have two great speakers today who I'm sure will reassure me and us about those nagging questions. So let me hand you over firstly to the appropriately named Paul Wood, author of no less than 3 essential books on London street trees. London is a Forest, London Tree Walks and London Street Trees, a book that's become something of a Bible to most of us for identification of urban trees. Paul, elms. What trees are we talking about?
Well, thank you, Simon. What trees are we talking about? Well, elm trees. And as I shall explain, there are a lot of different elm trees, and I'm going to take you through in fairly rapidly a bit of history, some species and cultivars, and some keys to identification. And I'm going to talk about the elms of Nine Elms a little bit as well. So, first of all, this webinar is made possible with grateful thanks to Wandsworth Borough Council, in which the South London enclave, shall we call it, of Nine Elms exists. Nine Elms has gone through a lot of changes in recent years, as anybody that lives in that part of London will know, or anybody that passes through Vauxhall will know. The US Embassy is there, and it was, of course, has a great elm legacy in the name. And this print, which I'm hoping will be coming up on your screen pretty much immediately, it was a drawing actually. This is out of the Wandsworth archives, and it's a image of the Nine Elms back in the early 19th century. The Nine Elms area was a little hamlet on the south bank of the river, and the most distinguishing feature in Nine Elms were the Nine Elms, and that was where it's got its name from. They continued growing there for centuries until probably around about the beginning of the late 19th and early 20th century, when Nine Elms became a very industrialized dockland area, and they were allowed to disappear, I think, and maybe Dutch elm disease did for them as well, which of course it did for many elm trees. And I think, though, it's worth thinking about elms being a key part of the environment in the UK and elsewhere as well. So elms are gave their names to Nine Elms. They gave them their names to other places as well. So we now don't have elms to the same degree in which our forebears had them. And my next slide is another image, historical image of elms. And this is a painting which is in the National Gallery in London. It's Mind Art Hobbema's The Avenue at Middle Harness, which of course is a Dutch town. And it is here seen with an avenue going into the town, and these are elm trees. Also, intriguingly, on the right-hand side, you will see an image of arboriculture, of horticulture, of young trees being grown in a nursery, and this is mid-17th century. Elm trees were an essential part of the landscape throughout Europe at this time. So how do you recognize elm trees? The slide behind me, my background, is elm flowers. And this is a tree which I photographed flowering in February this year. Elms flower late winter, and the image on your screen is a close-up of an emerging elm flower, and these can be absolutely abundant on elm trees. All elm trees flower. They're mostly red flowering, and they mostly flower in the late winter. There's only 1 or 2 species that differs from, and those are so rare you're very unlikely to encounter them, because most elms are pretty rare, to be honest. My next slide is just waiting for that to load. Now, where is it? Oh, getting a bit too far there. So the flowers, of course, are followed by the seeds. Now, these seeds are on a wych elm, one of the native elm species, and one which is less prone to Dutch elm disease. And this is in April. So the seeds appear before the leaves and can be quite abundant, particularly on a wych elm, which is one of the more frequent species you're likely to encounter. And the next slide is, this is a New Horizons elm, which is one of the new disease-resistant species which are now being planted. But like all elms, it has a lobe. The base of the leaf has a lobe on it, which is one side is more lobed than the other. And that is essential to identifying leaves in leaf, elms in leaf. They all have that feature. The shapes of the leaves can differ, the size of the leaves differ, but all elms have one side, which is one side of the leaf slightly more enlarged than the other. This is Robert Elms and me. That's I just thought I'd throw that one in. So I live in North London, in Islington, and you can see on this map of London whereabouts I live, and within walking distance of where I live are 2 champion elm trees. This one is a Chinese lacebark elm, that's Ulmus parvifolia, and this is the largest example of this rare Asian species of elm in the UK. And this is just near Archway Tube Station. In fact, there's a whole street of these Chinese lacebark elms. And this is a street tree, essentially, and it's the largest example of this species in the country. Elsewhere, this is another elm. This is Pinato ramosa, which is a cultivar of the Siberian elm. And this, again, is a champion. This is the tallest example of Pinato ramosa in the UK, and it's on a housing estate just around the corner from me in North Islington. So within most people's experience, elms are very rare, but I think you're probably closer to one than you imagine. There are more being planted. There are these outliers that were planted probably in the 70s and 80s, and these are often disease-resistant species and cultivars that didn't succumb to Dutch elm disease. But if you really want to go and see elms in all their glory, you need to go to Brighton. And this is Hove, actually. And this is a street in Hove, which is entirely lined with Wheatley elms. And these have this very particular habit, very specific shape, and these can become really huge. And there are thousands of these in Brighton. Brighton, of course, has managed to retain its elms through good husbandry, apart from anything else. Its geography helps. It's close, obviously, it's on the south coast next to the English Channel, and it has the South Downs behind it. And both of these have acted as a partial barrier to stop the beetles, which host elm disease coming into the city. They've also managed to cut down the first sign of Dutch elm disease that appears in a tree, that tree will get felled. And as a result of this judicious methodology, they've managed to retain elms. And now there are 17,000 elm trees throughout Brighton and Hove. And it gives a sense of what a landscape with elms would have looked like before the 1970s, when Dutch elm disease had such an impact on our elm trees. Also in Brighton, this is one of the Preston twins. The Preston twins, there is now only one. The other one died a few years ago. But the Preston twin, the surviving Preston twin, is the oldest elm tree in the UK and possibly the world. It's an English elm. It's thought to be about 400 years old, and it lives in Preston Park, right in the centre of Brighton. It's a really remarkable site. It's a huge tree, has a girth like that of an old oak tree. And again, it just goes to show what elm trees would have looked like in the landscape. And they would have been huge trees like oak trees, and we've lost millions of them. I'm going to show you some other elm trees as well. This one is near Wembley Stadium in North London, and it's quite a famous elm, this one. This is known as the Wembley elm. I think it's officially a Great Tree of London. If it's not officially, I regard it as a Great Tree of London. It is an example of the European white elm, which is Ulmus leavis, quite an unusual species that is thought could possibly be a native species. It's an unusual species which grows throughout Europe. It's more common in the south and east of Europe. There is another prime example, which is indeed another Great Tree of London, which is in Ladywell Fields in Lewisham. The Ladywell elm is a European white elm, despite what the sign says next to it, which was put there by Lewisham Council, which is incorrect. And I think it says it's a Huntingdon elm, but it's not. It's it's a European white elm. I think the next one that I've got to show you is, if my slides will move on, this is a Huntingdon elm, and this is another Great Tree of London. This is the Marylebone elm, which is on Marylebone High Street. It's a wonderful example of an elm tree that would have been quite a common species, particularly in southern Britain. And this one has miraculously survived Dutch elm disease. Having said that, some of the elms which I was showing you earlier would have been planted since Dutch elm disease. So the Pinato ramosa and the Chinese lacebark elms almost certainly planted in the 1970s or 80s. I have no records of when they were planted, but that was a point when some elms were planted again, and I think David will tell us more about that shortly. Elms, though, can be found all over the UK, and this one is a wych elm, one of the definitively native species of elm, which propagates itself from seeds, unlike the English elm, which is propagates through suckering. So essentially, it clonally reproduces itself, which also means that they're all genetically identical, which is a terrible thing when it comes to pests and diseases, because they're genetically identical, they're all going to succumb if one succumbs. Wych elms are not genetically identical. They seed themselves quite freely, and so are a bit more resistant to Dutch elm disease. And this magnificent example of a wych elm I discovered in the city centre in Sheffield. It's one of the biggest elm trees I've ever seen. And certainly the biggest wych elm I've ever seen, a really tremendous example of a native elm tree that you would unlikely to see one so big, but possibly the most likely species you're going to encounter. Elm trees have cultivars as well, and this is a cultivar of a wych elm. This is horizontalis, which, and this is an example which is in Dover, right on the seafront in Dover, quite a fine example. I think this was possibly planted in the 1950s. There are two cultivars of wych elm, which you're likely to come across, horizontalis, which looks rather like this, and then the even more pendular one, which is the Camperdown elm, which was first discovered in the gardens of Camperdown House in Dundee. And that's a tree which I haven't got a photograph of, I'm afraid, but is a tremendous weeping tree, which you often see in parks and churchyards, both examples of wych elm. I'm going to take us back to Nine Elms. Things been changing. As you can see, Nine Elms stretches all the way, rapidly constructed into luxury flats. A lot of development is going on. A lot of trees are being planted, some of which are elm trees. The one on the right isn't an elm tree. This is a tree of heaven. And this is a tree which is unlikely to last very long. This is a tree which loves urban environments and has seeded itself or suckered itself in the building site. And you can see in the foreground there, a Battersea Borough Council electricity supply cabinet showing you where we are, a historical link to the past. And here is the future. On the left is an example of New Horizons, one of the disease-resistant cultivars which is being planted these days. And this has been planted in the last 5 or 10 years. Well, actually, it's been planted in the last 3 years, I'd say. This is in the new enclave of Nine Elms. You can see the US Embassy in the back there. And again, this is the US Embassy, which has lots of interesting tree planting around it, not particularly elms. This is, they're mostly American species, and this is a river birch right in front of the US Embassy there. Now, moving on from there, I think I'm going to show you the two new elms which have been planted in front of the US Embassy, where the Nine Elms are at Nine Elms. And these are Lutetia, another disease-resistant cultivar which has been planted in recent years. Here they are in the winter, just after having been planted in 2019. For many years, there were just 7 elms there, but from 2019, there were 9 again, which is a wonderful connection to the place's, the place name, the place's history, and its past. These is an image of the 2 elms being planted, and these are members of the local community and Wandsworth Council planting those elm trees. And I was lucky enough to be at this event. And here is an image of the 9 elms. So you can count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A small one, 6, which must have been planted about 10 years, 7, 8 in the foreground, the new elms, which were planted in 2019. And I will very shortly, once I've stopped sharing, hand back to Simon before handing over to David.
Paul, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and great to see new elms being planted, not just at the Nine Elms site, but the New Horizon one just opposite in the development at New Elms too. So that's very exciting. So now I'd like to, well, we've got some question. We've got a question prepared, but it's what is an elm tree? I think you probably answered that very nicely since it was asked. Do feel free, if anyone's got any other questions, to still for Paul, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll be answering all of those, or hopefully they'll have answers to them at the end. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce you to our second speaker, David Shreeve. Okay, David is founder of the Conservation Foundation, whose work has protected and re-established elms in Britain after the ravages of Dutch elm disease in the 1970s. David, elms, tell us about their history and their future.
Well, thank you very much. I assume you can hear me, and that the technical situation is working. First of all, I'd like to thank Paul Wood, who is such an expert on all trees. And Paul, you didn't mention your maps, but I know that there are some friends of mine watching today. I keep getting your maps sent to me as birthday presents. So I would like to tell my friends, like Lavinia, who was watching, that I now have enough copies of Paul Wood's maps. Thank you very much. I've only got 1 copy of his book, but I do have that too. So, Paul, you have a place on my bookshelf, which I very much value. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, now, I want everybody to think back, and I suspect I'm going to ask some people to think back longer than they were actually around, but I want to take you back to the days when I was working for a public relations company with a client, an American company called Pitney Bowes, and they were based in Harlow in Essex. And it was my first visit to the client and indeed to Harlow. And after discussing the company's plans for launching its new franking machines and photocopiers, the last item on the agenda was visit of the American ambassador. I asked what the plans were, but there were none. So I suggested that the ambassador could plant something at the front of their building, and the company's chairman suggested an elm tree, as all the elms around had been lost in recent years due to Dutch elm disease. And then he added that whilst visiting the company's head office in the States, he had read somewhere that someone had discovered a disease-resistant elm. Maybe we could get one. And that was my introduction to elms. I came back to London, got on to the American embassy, which was then in Grosvenor Square, of course, and I tracked down, I'm not getting my slides for some reason. Just bear with me. Anyone know how this works?
I think you need to press the arrow, little arrow button, David.
Ah, the little arrow.
Yeah.
Ah, brilliant. Thank you, Paul. I'm glad you still stayed on to hear me, since I would have missed you. So I tracked down Professor Smalley, Eugene Smalley of the University of Wisconsin, who had been traveling the world looking for healthy elms to replace trees lost in the States. He was experimenting with disease-resistant elm trees derived from open pollinated seed collected from a Siberian elm growing in the botanical gardens of Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan. Well, we talked, and not only did he agree to providing some Sapporo Autumn Golds on the understanding that he could give no guarantee of them growing in our climate or that they would have any resistance in the long term. And in addition, he said he would come over and join us to help plant them. And so on the 15th of October, 1979, I picked up the professor from his hotel in London and we drove to Harlow. His trees had already arrived, and so had representatives of the world's media, including John Craven's Newsround. The press had not turned up to see the United States ambassador, however, and certainly not to see Pitney Bowes' franking machines and photocopiers. Instead, they all wanted to know about these magic trees. You have to remember that at this time, the country had lost a huge number of its elms. At some point, the Forestry Commission estimated that some 27 million elms had been lost, and more were succumbing to the disease as it moved northwards. So here we were with a professor from Wisconsin on the right, an ambassador from the States who had been president of Yale, which is in New Haven, also known as Elm City. That's the ambassador, Kingman Brewster, on the left, and a load of guests, plus some of the Pitney Bowes staff, all to launch a simple tree project which had started out as elms across Essex, then elms across England, and by the time we launched, it had become elms across Europe. You must appreciate that I was no tree expert, and I was soon to discover that tree experts were not necessarily enthusiastic about my activities. Indeed, the head of the Tree Council had turned up at Harlow for the launch, and he said in a very loud voice, "What on earth do you think you're doing planting these Japanese weeds?" Well, the following spring, we planted more, 2 in Hyde Park and another 2 at Windsor Castle. When Prince Philip arrived, or we asked him to plant the trees in Hyde Park actually first, he said, "No way, I am the ranger of Windsor Great Park, and if I'm going to plant elms anywhere, I'll plant them at Windsor." So we had to ask Wisconsin to send us over a couple more trees for HRH. Windsor is a large park, as you will all know, and so you can imagine our surprise when we turned up for the planting to find that it was going to be very, very close to the castle's private apartments. Obviously, the Duke was going to keep his eye on it regularly and monitor its progress. Well, that was the first sign the following year that the tree was living, and it started to grow. And then after a couple of years, it grew a bit more like this. And this was the tree earlier this year. So obviously Prince Philip had looked after the tree very well. More celebrity plantings helped to promote the project when the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, visited Harlow with her husband Dennis. They both planted Sapporo Autumn Golds and took away another one to plant at Chequers. Dennis planted his Sapporo Autumn Gold on a roundabout, and this tree was to prove to be a successful milestone when butterfly enthusiasts discovered white-letter hair streak butterflies feeding on it. This was just the news we had been waiting for, because, as you probably know, white-letter hair streaks only feed on elms, and this proved that this Japanese weed really was a tree which would provide a sustainable food source. Michael Heseltine, who became Lord Heseltine, but when he was Minister of the Environment, he came to launch the Conservation Foundation in 1982. He was given 2 Sapporo Autumn Golds for his arboretum, and this picture from last year shows they are still doing well. Note the autumn gold colour. Interest grew, and the company in Harlow continued to support and even bought a greenhouse so the company's gardener, Arthur Smith, could help propagate some more trees, as well as the trees, which were mostly for schools at that stage. We produced a 50-year diary for the schools to record the history of their trees. And we also produced this poster, which showed the biodiversity that elms could attract. Fired by the success of the initial Elms Across Europe project, I had an idea that I could improve my standing in my PR company. So I took my boss out for lunch and suggested that I set up a new department in the company to organize similar schemes for other clients. Halfway through the lunch, my boss got up and said he saw no future in environmental issues, and if I thought this was a good idea, then perhaps I should do it elsewhere. He even left me to pay the bill and find a new job. Fortunately, I knew David Bellamy and got him involved in both the Elm projects, and also suggests he could help me start something new. In this picture, he doesn't look very pleased. He was probably thinking, this is another crazy idea of Shreeve. to get me into. Anyway, we joined forces, and we did set up the Conservation Foundation, and we're actually 40 years on. We're planning its 40th celebration. The Conservation Foundation has organised all sorts of workshops around tables. I'll see if I've got a picture of one here. There you are. That's a workshop we had for elm enthusiasts down in Sussex University. We've created quite a group of enthusiasts, actually. So if any of you are taking part in this webinar, I say hello. We've produced newsletters to keep people in touch. And generally, we've been trying over the years to keep an interest going in elms. Now, I'm conscious that this is the Urban Tree Festival, and we've been involved with various elms in London. This is an elm in Hyde Park, which we woke up one morning and found London had a hurricane. But fortunately, the weekend was going to be an event in Hyde Park, and the organisers had put marquees around the elm tree. So whilst a lot of elms had been lost, ours had survived thanks to the marquees. On another occasion, a terror incident at a nearby embassy meant that our elm got police protection. And so since the foundation's been going, we've done various projects involving elms. And I have to be honest, lots of them have been experimental. We never quite knew what would happen, but we were very fortunate in getting the Heritage Lottery to help fund a project called Ulmus Londinium. All, of course, made up by me, these titles, but it sounded a good name. This was our programme for London, which was launched at the Natural History Museum. It helped us put the spotlight on a wide variety of London's existing elms, some of which are, of course, on Paul's map. And we did projects involving schools and gave schools a tree. We also produced an A to Z of the history of London's elms, which many of you will know goes back to London's water supplies. And we also provided trees for people who lived in London with an address like this, Elmwood Road. So we said, well, if you live in, your address is in an Elm Street and you haven't got a tree, we help them get a tree for their road. Up until then, of course, I'm going back a bit now because I wanted to say how we moved from Sapporo Autumn Gold into native elms. And this is a picture of Francis Rose, who was in fact, David Bellamy, this was David's hero. Francis Rose was this amazing botanist. And we were at an event at Kew Gardens for plant life. And during the tea break, Francis said to me, do you know, I go around the country doing surveys of plants, and I look up and I'm forever seeing elm trees. I think there are actually more trees around than are given credit for. And so this got me thinking, and I thought, well, maybe we should broaden our search of the nation's elm trees. And with Francis's support, we started to make people aware of how trees, there might be a tree in their street and they hadn't realized it. And we'd also told the story of how useful elms have been, their historic stories, so that elm had been so important to craftsmen and furniture makers, lock keepers and water suppliers, coffin makers and bellow makers, even pharmacists used elms, and it wasn't something of the past. It featured in old prints and old poetry. We knew that elms had a future in the modern world. So the search went on to find not only native elms, but to find some that might take part in an experiment to propagate. And as you know, young elm needs to reach about 11 years old before it can be affected by disease. And so we have planted quite a few trees propagated from native trees, and they're growing away, and we keep in touch with the people who have them to see just whether some might survive. Why they do, it remains a mystery. But just because they're old trees, it doesn't mean that they propagate young, which are resistant as well. So it's a bit of an experiment, a bit of a mystery, but we think it's worth trying to find out some of these answers. But the foundation is not into the commercial tree business. And so this is still very much an experiment, growing only a limited number of trees. We have to leave it to the commercial growers to replace the millions lost, either by disease, development, or indeed high winds. But it is interesting to see the increase in interest in elms. Other trees have their problems, which may prove even worse for them. And maybe people who thought that elms had had it were being somewhat premature. There are a number of companies and individuals now looking at resistant elms from America or European countries. That's a great picture, isn't it, of the elms? That's what so many of them have been lost, but it's great to find that picture. But here are some new ones. This elm walk has been created with 47 New Horizon elms planted by the Royal Parks and the Friends of Richmond Park. This new book records the efforts of a group of enthusiasts who have used elm to build a barn, as they all used to be. This is in Hertfordshire, and its author, Robert Somerville, foresees a rich future for elm wood in the building industry. Scientists at Kew Gardens are working on a possible new elm research program and waiting to hear each day whether they've been successful in getting funding to do that. But we were able to find some funds for their colleagues at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, who are this year going to be starting research on wych elms. And this is a picture of a wych elm, as you see, with the Scottish mountain behind it. We have this map featuring some of the known elms in the country. And we'd be very interested to hear from some volunteers who would be interested in helping us to map more of the elms and indeed to help support our elm projects in any way. Well, there's the American Embassy again, and one of their security policemen started to come towards us as we took this picture, wondering what we were doing outside their embassy with a camera. But we got on terribly well with him, and we told him about his elms. And this is the strange twist to our story, because these could be Sapporo Autumn Golds. They look the right height for a 40-year-old elm. The leaves and the flowers that Paul was talking about certainly look right. And the amazing thing is that, what we couldn't have known some 40 years ago was that someone would decide that the US Embassy in Grosvenor Square would move to a place known as Nine Elms. And if they are what we think they are, and we're fairly sure they are, Sapporo Autumn Gold, the current US ambassador drives home from the office facing a group of elm trees which could place their roots back to Wisconsin, and before that Japan, and before that Siberia, all because a predecessor went on a day trip to Harlow. Well, I hope my presentation has lived up to its title, The Elms of Nine Elms and Beyond. Indeed, the elms of Nine Elms may just have, in a strange way, come full circle. So thank you to Simon for pressing the buttons, and you'll have to tell me how I get out of this.
David, that was absolutely amazing, and it's wonderful that I think everyone will agree, but we have mature elms, including the ones at Nine Elms, to see, thanks to your work and the work of the Conservation Foundation. I've put a link in the chat for people to get involved in the Great Elm experiment, and I hope you do. I hope you take the opportunity to do that. Very worthwhile. So thank you very much. I'm actually blown away by the thought that the American embassy, the American ambassador, might have planted the trees 40 years before the American embassy moved to Nine Elms. I think that is just an extraordinary premonition of the thing. Very spooky.
Well, I hope he's watching the webinar.
Yeah. I will send it to him. We'll send it to him. Now, some things have come in through the Q&A. I don't know if Paul and David would like to have a little look at that, and perhaps we could ask some questions. I saw one which we might touch on. Why are elms so special? This is from Kyra Williams, in your view, compared to other trees. And do you think that's because of the biodiversity they support?
Well, I think it is, and I think it's also, the variety of uses that they've been put to. I mean, originally it is thought that the Romans brought elms to this country to grow vines on. Whether that's true or not, Paul will know a lot more about this than I do. But I mean, it is, the story I referred to earlier was London got its water supply through hollowed out elm trees, and children are fascinated. Children, trees are trees, really. If you can add a story and show that the importance of elm to the white letter hair streak is amazing, because it's all that butterfly feeds on, and therefore if we lose the elms, we lose the butterflies. It's as simple as that. And that is an example of so much of biodiversity, and it's nature, and if you could make nature come alive, it gets right to the roots of well-being. And we all look. I've even brought my elm tree in from the garden. So this is a first, Simon. You were saying it might be the first time you've had a real tree on the programme.
It is wonderful, and so lucky that the Sapporo Autumn Gold, which was not a native British variety, supported the butterfly. That was just chance, was it?
Well, I don't know why Dennis Thatcher planted his tree on a roundabout. I suspect whilst the Prime Minister was doing a tour of the factory, he nipped down to the local pub and then sort of lost his way on the way home or back, and fell down on the roundabout. I don't know. But some elm or butterfly enthusiasts came upon the roundabout at some stage, and they were jumping up and down and saying, "Isn't this fantastic? This pretty rare butterfly has found this pretty rare tree, and it's having Sunday lunch here."
Absolutely. And looking more through the chat, Lavinia wondered who's been responsible for growing the disease-resistant varieties? Who are the growers, the big growers of the elm trees now? I think Lavinia might be interested in getting one.
Well, she's lots of different places where she can get them, and there's lots of different varieties of disease-resistant ones as well. But there's been a long history of developing disease-resistant varieties, which started in the 1930s when there was an outbreak, and that's where we get the name Dutch elm disease. There was an outbreak of elm disease in the Netherlands. It was identified, well, it was all over Europe, but it was identified first in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands was very reliant on elm trees in their landscape and started a program of developing disease-resistant elms. And since then, there have been many different types have been developed. American elms succumbed to Dutch elm disease at the same time as European elms, and Americans have been developing Dutch disease-resistant elms, but Dutch elm disease itself originates in Asia, and because species in Asia have grown up with that pathogen, they're more resistant. So David mentioned Sapporo Autumn Gold, which is a cultivar of several different or a hybrid of several different species, but most from East Asia, where the disease resistance is more built into their genes. So these genetically diverse, but also genetically tolerant species tend to have some East Asian genes in them, and many different nurseries will have developed them, and many different nurseries will be selling them. So New Horizons, for instance, you can get from Hilliers. There's a plug for Hilliers.
Quite right too. And another one, I don't know, maybe Paul, Kyra Williams was wondering, did elms once populate Elmstead Woods? Would you know that?
Well, elm trees aren't really a tree of woodland. I think that what's more likely to happen is that, like Nine Elms, they would have been a significant geographical feature in the area, and they would have been part of that. That's where the name came from. Elm trees tend to be found in woodland on the edges of woodland. Wych elm you do sometimes find in woodland, but the sort of more typical English elm that would have been the dominant species in the centuries prior to that is more likely to be a field boundary or an edge of wood tree.
Very good. Well, just a moment or two longer for any last minute questions. So perhaps we could round up there. I would like, it's been really fascinating to hear you both. A big thank you to both our speakers, Paul and David, for their presentations. The webinar is going to be available on the Urban Tree Festival YouTube channel in due course, hopefully within the next 48 hours. We're quite busy. Thank you for everyone who's come along and for being such an attentive audience and asking interesting questions. May I once again ask you to consider a donation to the Urban Tree Festival so we can do more of this next year. I think it's important that we're talking about trees and keep the conversation going. I've put another link to donations in the chat. Thank you all very much once again for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.